Para's puppies are taken, but the unexpected rescuer left everyone stunned. Amid the dusty, chaotic streets and the oppressive gray sky, a lone figure roamed through the alleys, her fragile body carrying the weight of a relentless struggle for survival. Sarah wasn't just another stray. Her every day was a fight, her every step a testament to resilience. Her once pristine coat, which might have been soft and snowy white, was now a dull, tangled mess, stained with dirt and shadowed by despair. The shine that once reflected a carefree life had long been replaced by the grime of countless restless days. Sarah's existence was a cycle of endless challenges, days full of hunger and uncertainty, nights haunted by the bitter chill of loneliness. Hello friends, right now write in the comments your name and where you are watching this video from. We really appreciate each of you. You are incredibly important to us and to the promotion of our channel. Thanks to you, we can tell such stories and open our eyes to injustice. You are our inspiration, and together, we can make this world a better place. Enjoy watching. Curled in the dim corners of an alley, Sarah often tried to steal moments of rest, only to be startled awake by distant echoes. The mournful howls of other strays rang out like a haunting melody of shared misfortune, interspersed with the sharp cries of humans who cared little for her plight. Passers-by rarely gave her a second glance. Some even hurled stones or chased her away when she dared to approach, desperate for scraps of food. Hunger gnawed at her constantly, a relentless reminder of her frailty. Her legs, worn from endless wandering, barely held her trembling frame. The summer sun brought no mercy. Its harsh rays scorched the pavement, forcing Sarah to seek shelter beneath parked cars or beside garbage bins. Yet even those shadows offered no refuge. Territorial dogs growled her away, and shopkeepers yelled at her to leave when she got too close. By night, the blistering heat of the asphalt gave way to a bone-chilling cold that seeped through her thin body, leaving her shivering and drained. Rainy days told a different story of hardship. The ominous clouds overhead signaled another trial as the first drops fell. Frantically, Sarah would dart toward the nearest doorway or cracked roof, but the rain inevitably found her, soaking her fur until the cold water dripped relentlessly from her body. Exhausted and soaked, she soldiered on, her spirit battered but not broken. As the relentless rain poured down, Sarah curled into a trembling ball in a desolate corner, her ears pressed flat against her head. Her sad eyes, clouded with fatigue, gazed into the void as her frail body shivered uncontrollably. She waited for the storm to pass, resigned to her solitude. The headlights of passing cars and the hurried silhouettes of indifferent pedestrians blurred together, accompanied by the ceaseless sound of the rain pounding against the pavement. No one stopped to help. No one even looked. Despite the hopelessness of her existence, Sarah kept moving forward. Survival wasn't a choice, it was an instinct etched into her bones. Her only guides were her sharp senses, leading her through alleyways and garbage-strewn streets. Every so often, she found a scrap of food, a discarded bone, a crust of hardened bread. It was never enough, but it kept her alive. Trusting humans was a luxury she couldn't afford. To Sarah, they were the ones who had driven her to this life, the ones who yelled, chased, and ignored her. She had learned that a friendly hand was often a fleeting illusion. But on one fateful day, her fortunes shifted. The summer sun beat down mercilessly, heating the asphalt until it burned her paws. Thirst clung to her dry throat as she wandered aimlessly. Then, a scent unlike any other reached her sensitive nose, a heavenly aroma of fresh bread and roasted meat. Guided by the tantalizing smell, Sarah followed the trail to a small market stall. Behind it stood Pedro, a man in his 60s with kind, weathered eyes and a serene demeanor. His steady gaze softened when he saw Sarah's timid approach. Her gaunt frame and weary movements spoke of endless struggles, and his heart ached for her. Pedro crouched slowly, careful not to startle her, and placed a piece of bread gently on the ground near his leg. He stayed still, his movements deliberate, giving her the space to decide. Sarah froze, her distrust of humans battling against her overwhelming hunger. She watched him cautiously, her instincts on high alert. "Hey friends. Sorry to disturb you. Please take a moment to share your name and where you're watching this video from in the comments. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. Your support means the world to us and plays a crucial role in promoting our channel. Because of you, we can share these important stories and shed light on injustices. You inspire us, and together, we can make the world a better place. Enjoy the video. After what felt like an eternity, hunger triumphed. Sarah crept closer, each step tentative and calculated, until she was within reach of the bread. Snatching it quickly with her jaws, she backed away and devoured it with desperate speed. Pedro didn't move, his patience unwavering. He let her take her time, showing no signs of hostility. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Sarah felt something strange: safety. That small gesture, a simple piece of bread, marked the beginning of a profound change in her life. Pedro returned the next day, and then the day after, each time with a small offering tucked into his pocket. Sarah began to recognize the sound of his footsteps and would wait for him at the same spot. A bond, fragile at first, slowly began to form between them. To Pedro, Sarah was no longer just a street dog. She was a soul in need of care, and he couldn't ignore the connection growing between them. One day, after months of careful interactions, Pedro made a life-changing decision. He bent down, extended his hand to Sarah, and quietly invited her into his world. With cautious steps, she followed him to his home. For Sarah, the experience was surreal. She had no idea what awaited her, but as she crossed the threshold of Pedro's modest house, a new sensation enveloped her. Security. The small home, though simple, radiated warmth and care. A small garden surrounded the property, offering her a safe space to roam freely for the first time. The relentless hunger and icy nights were left behind. Pedro provided her with fresh food, a soft blanket to sleep on, and something Sarah had never known before: a gentle touch. His hand rested softly on her head, and for the first time, she didn't flinch. Slowly, she began to understand that not all humans were the same. Not all sought to harm or chase her away. Months passed, and an extraordinary event marked Sarah's new life. She gave birth to 4 beautiful snow-white puppies. Their tiny bodies and soft whimpers filled the house with joy. For Sarah, they were a symbol of renewal and love, a chance to build something she had never thought possible. Sarah dedicated herself to her pups with unwavering care. Every movement, every sound from them drew her attention, ensuring their safety. The maternal instinct she had carried through her struggles was now nurtured by the security Pedro provided. Her heart swelled with contentment, knowing her pups would never face the hardships she endured. Pedro, too, poured his heart into caring for the tiny family. He woke early to ensure fresh food and water were always ready, and spent long afternoons watching the puppies play in the garden. Occasionally, Sarah allowed Pedro to approach them, her watchful eyes following his every move. She trusted him now, an earned trust built on his kindness and patience. The house came alive with the sound of little paws scampering across the floors. The air filled with the soft, warm scent of the puppies, and the once quiet home became a sanctuary of love and laughter. For the first time in her life, Sarah was truly happy. Each night, she rested peacefully, confident that Pedro was there to protect her and her family. But peace has its enemies. One night, Sarah's sharp instincts alerted her to a lurking presence. A shadow moved near the house, staying just out of sight but close enough to unsettle her. Her protective nature surged as she felt a new threat closing in, one unlike anything she had faced before. The night was eerily quiet. The full moon bathed the garden in silver light, and a gentle wind rustled the trees. Sarah remained alert, her eyes scanning the darkness, her senses heightened. The time of peace she had found was at risk, and deep in her heart, she knew everything was about to change. Sarah slept soundly in the small bed Pedro had placed for her outside the house, her puppies nestled close against her. Their tiny bodies radiated warmth, and the soft murmur of their rhythmic breathing gave her a rare sense of peace. For once, all seemed right in her world. But the tranquility didn't last. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught a flicker of movement near the gate. A dark figure loomed in the shadows, watching intently. Sarah's heart quickened. This wasn't a passing stranger or a harmless bystander. It was a presence she instinctively recognized as a threat. Her protective instincts kicked in immediately. She lifted her head, her sharp gaze fixed on the intruder. Every muscle in her body tensed as a wave of alertness coursed through her. Her ears flattened against her head, and a low growl rumbled from her throat before erupting into a loud, desperate bark. The sound cut through the stillness of the night, a warning that refused to be ignored. Inside the house, Pedro stirred at the noise. His deep sleep was shattered, and with it, his patience. While Pedro was a kind and gentle soul, his tolerance for being woken at night was thin. Grumbling under his breath, he rolled out of bed, his face flushed with irritation. He loved Sarah and her puppies dearly, but interrupted sleep was one of the few things that could test his composure. Throwing on his slippers, Pedro stepped outside into the cool night air. The garden was bathed in pale moonlight, the shadows long and still. He marched toward the gate, muttering under his breath, convinced that Sarah's barking was unwarranted. When he reached the gate, he looked around but saw nothing. The street was empty, cloaked in the usual quiet of the early hours. The figure Sarah had seen was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. Pedro frowned, scanning the area once more. The only movement came from the gentle sway of the trees in the breeze. Confused and still grumpy, Pedro turned his gaze to Sarah. She remained rigid, her eyes fixed on the spot where the figure had been. Her body language screamed vigilance, her unwavering stance a testament to the threat she had sensed. But Pedro, blinded by his impatience, dismissed her behavior as paranoia. "Sarah," he scolded, his voice low but firm, "you can't bark in the middle of the night like this. If you wake me up again for no reason, I'll have to tie you up in the kennel." Sarah lowered her head slightly, her ears twitching at his tone, but her resolve didn't waver. She could still feel the presence lingering, even if Pedro couldn't see it. For her, the danger was real, and her barks were a shield meant to protect the family she had come to love. As Pedro turned and walked back toward the house, grumbling about sleepless nights, Sarah stayed vigilant. She knew what she had seen, and she knew it wasn't over. The threat was out there, waiting. And when it returned, she would be ready. "Do you understand? I don't want to hear another bark." Pedro's firm tone lingered in the air as he turned and walked back to the house. Sarah lowered her ears, her gaze drifting downward, but her unease didn't waver. Deep inside, she felt the same lurking danger that had unsettled her before. She couldn't explain it. She only knew something was wrong. Yet, out of loyalty to Pedro and her puppies, she stayed silent, suppressing her instinct to cry out again. Even as Pedro disappeared into the house, Sarah's body remained taut with vigilance. Every fiber of her being stayed attuned to the world around her, ready to react at the slightest hint of danger. She nestled close to her puppies, seeking to shield them from whatever menace might return. The next morning, Pedro woke up feeling groggy and irritable. His interrupted sleep had left him restless through the night, and now, as he shuffled around the house, a cloud of fatigue hung heavy over him. Even the simplest things grated on his nerves. Though his inherent kindness remained, his patience had worn thin. As he sat at the breakfast table, every creak of the chair, every clink of a spoon against a plate seemed to magnify his frustration. Outside, Sarah sat quietly in the garden, her eyes fixed on Pedro with a mix of confusion and worry, as if trying to understand the reason for his mood. The day dragged on slowly. Pedro tried to distract himself with small tasks, but his mind kept circling back to the events of the previous night. The memory of Sarah's insistent barking and his own irritation lingered like a shadow. He dismissed the idea of danger, chalking her behavior up to some imagined noise or harmless movement in the dark. Surely it was nothing, he thought. But deep down, a small uneasy feeling lingered, buried beneath his rationalizations. As evening fell, Pedro, still weighed down by fatigue, decided to turn in early. He yearned for an uninterrupted night of rest, hoping the peace of sleep would restore his usual calm. Sarah, however, couldn't shake her unease. Lying in the garden with her puppies curled close, she remained restless. The tension in the air felt palpable, her instincts urging her to stay alert. Her ears twitched at every rustle of leaves, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows. The night had a heaviness to it, as though it held a secret waiting to reveal itself. And then she saw it. The figure returned. Sarah's ears shot up, her body stiffened, and a low growl began to rise in her throat. The shadow loomed near the edge of the garden, bolder now, its intent unmistakable. This time she knew. Whatever was out there was coming closer, and the peace she had fought so hard to find was under threat once more. The dark figure stood motionless, its shadow stretching ominously across the front yard. Its piercing eyes seemed fixed on the corner of the garden where Sarah and her puppies lay. A shiver of alarm coursed through Sarah as recognition set in. It was the same intruder from the previous night. Her protective instincts roared to life, her only thought to shield her little ones from whatever danger this man posed. Sarah's bark rang out again, louder and more desperate this time. Her voice carried through the still night, an unmistakable warning. Inside the house, Pedro jolted awake, his heart racing from the sudden noise. Frustration boiled over as he got up, this time determined to put an end to what he perceived as Sarah's inexplicable behavior. Throwing on a jacket, Pedro stormed out to the garden. His footsteps were heavy with anger as he marched toward the gate, muttering under his breath. But, like the night before, the figure had vanished. The street lay empty under the dim glow of the moon, silent and still, offering no clue to what had disturbed Sarah. Pedro's frustration turned to fury. His gaze fell on Sarah, who stood alert, her eyes fixed on the spot where the man had been. She looked up at Pedro, her expression restless and pleading, as if trying to convey the danger he couldn't see. But Pedro, blinded by his impatience, only saw defiance. "I warned you, Sarah," he said firmly, his voice tinged with anger. "I can't spend another night dealing with your barking." Pedro turned and walked to the kennel, pulling out the chain. Without hesitation, he firmly tied Sarah inside. She watched him, her eyes filled with confusion and worry, but she didn't resist. She trusted Pedro, even if he couldn't sense the looming danger. His actions were not meant to harm her, but his inability to understand the threat left her feeling isolated. As Pedro turned off the lights and returned to bed, darkness enveloped the garden. The house fell silent once more, but for Sarah the sense of foreboding remained. She stood tethered, her body taut with tension, her eyes scanning every corner of the yard. Her sharp instincts searched for any movement, any shadow that might signal the return of the intruder. The chain restricted her, keeping her at a distance from her puppies, who were nestled together in the small bed Pedro had made for them. Sarah's frustration grew as her protective instincts battled against the limitations imposed on her. She could feel the threat lurking, circling just beyond her reach, and her heart ached with the weight of helplessness. But even as she stood restrained, Sarah's resolve didn't falter. Her loyalty to her family, her need to protect her pups, burned stronger than ever. She vowed silently that, no matter the cost, she would face whatever danger threatened her home. That's when she saw him. The man reappeared, emerging from the shadows with deliberate, purposeful strides. This time there was no hesitation in his movements. His eyes locked onto the small bed where Sarah's puppies lay curled up, unaware of the danger creeping closer. Sarah's heart pounded as realization dawned. He was here for her babies. Panic surged through her as she began barking frantically, her voice cutting through the stillness of the night. She pulled against the chain with all her strength, the metal biting into her neck as she strained to break free. But no matter how hard she tried, the chain held firm, restricting her to the path. She could do nothing but watch in helpless agony. Her desperate barks echoed through the garden, filled with anguish and fear, but the night remained silent. No one came to help. Her ears flattened against her head, and her body quivered with tension as she stared at the man. His figure moved closer to her puppies, each step deliberate, his movements shrouded in an eerie calmness. The full moon cast long shadows over the garden, and Sarah's sharp eyes tracked his every move. Her heart raced as the man crouched low, his hands reaching toward the defenseless puppies who slept peacefully, oblivious to the approaching threat. Her maternal instincts surged, filling her with a need to protect them at any cost. But the unyielding chain held her back. Each futile attempt to free herself only deepened her despair. Her barks turned frantic, her voice raw and pleading as she watched the man's hands close around the first puppy. The small, fragile body was lifted from the bed with disturbing ease. Sarah let out a mournful whine, her voice cracking under the weight of her desperation. It was a sound that carried not just fear, but a mother's anguish, a primal cry begging for her babies to be spared. Tears stung her eyes as she threw herself against the chain one last time, her body trembling with exhaustion. The sight of her puppy in the intruder's hands broke something inside her. She moaned softly, her cries carrying into the night like a plea for help, but no one answered. The man, unfazed by her resistance, remained calm and methodical. His shadow loomed over the remaining puppies, as Sarah's helplessness turned into a searing mixture of rage and sorrow. Though she was bound and powerless, her spirit burned with one unwavering thought. This was not over. The man's cold, mocking gaze pierced Sarah, freezing her in a mix of terror and fury. His eyes radiated a cruel, calculated malice, the corners of his mouth curling into a perverse smile as he held the first puppy tightly in his arms. Without breaking eye contact, he turned slowly toward the exit, each deliberate step designed to deepen her agony. Sarah barked with every ounce of strength she had left, her desperate cries reverberating through the night. Her body shook violently with the force of her struggle, the chain digging mercilessly into her neck as she strained against it. Her legs, slick with the wet ground beneath her, slipped helplessly. Her once powerful barks began to falter, interspersed with strained whimpers, raw, guttural sounds of anguish that seemed to tear through her very soul. The man returned, his movements unhurried as if savoring every moment of her torment. Ignoring her desperate pleas, he reached for another puppy. Sarah lunged forward with renewed desperation, her teeth snapping at the empty air as she fought to free herself. The chain clanked with each attempt, tightening further around her throat. Her muscles burned and her heart raced, but the man remained unfazed, taking the second puppy without hesitation. Each time he returned, the man's dark, gleeful eyes met Sarah's. They conveyed a sinister satisfaction, an unspoken message that her pain was his pleasure. He moved methodically, taking one helpless puppy after another, while Sarah's cries grew weaker and more fractured. Her spirit burned fiercely, but her body was nearing its breaking point. By the time he reached the last puppy, Sarah was trembling uncontrollably. Her barks had become hoarse, her voice barely audible as exhaustion and despair weighed her down. Yet she couldn't stop. She barked and whimpered with every shred of strength she had left, her cries echoing in the night like a final plea for mercy. The man lifted the last puppy with the same chilling composure, cradling it in his arms as he turned to face Sarah one last time. His mocking gaze lingered on her, savoring the devastation etched across her face. With a smirk, he walked toward the gate, disappearing into the shadows with her precious little ones. Sarah collapsed to the ground, her body trembling and her strength finally abandoning her. Her head drooped low, her ears flat against her skull. She released one final mournful howl, a sound so raw and sorrowful it seemed to cut through the very fabric of the night. It was a cry of pure agony, an expression of pain that no words could capture, echoing into the darkness as the silence closed in around her. Alone, chained and devastated, Sarah remained motionless, her heart shattered. Yet, deep in her soul, a faint ember of resolve still flickered. This wasn't the end. Somehow, some way, she would find her puppies. She would fight for them, and she would make sure this evil man faced justice. The night dragged on, and Sarah lay in the same spot, her trembling body too weak to move but her mind unable to rest. The absence of her puppies weighed heavily on her, their warmth and tiny breaths now replaced by an unbearable emptiness. The shadows of the garden seemed darker, the silence more oppressive, as if the world itself had turned against her. Hours passed, and the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the garden in soft hues of pink and gold. But for Sarah, the light brought no comfort. Her heart ached with a pain she had never known. She couldn't let this be the end, not for her puppies. She had to act. When Pedro emerged from the house in the morning, still groggy and irritable, he found Sarah lying motionless, her chain taut and her eyes fixed on the gate. Her usually bright gaze was dull, her energy drained. But something about her posture, the intense determination in her expression, gave him pause. "Hey friends. Sorry to disturb you. Please take a moment to share your name and where you're watching this video from in the comments. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. Your support means the world to us and plays a crucial role in promoting our channel. Because of you, we can share these important stories and shed light on injustices. You inspire us, and together we can make the world a better place. Enjoy the video." "Sarah," he called out, his voice softer now, tinged with concern. He knelt beside her, unfastening the chain, and gently stroked her head. "What's wrong, girl?" Sarah didn't respond the way she usually did. There was no excited wag of her tail, no soft whimper of affection. Instead, she turned her head sharply toward the gate and let out a low, mournful growl. Pedro frowned, his brows knitting together as he looked at her more closely. For the first time, he noticed the strain in her body, the way her fur was damp with sweat, and the exhaustion etched into her every movement. Something wasn't right. Pedro stood and opened the gate, stepping outside to scan the street. It was empty, just like the nights before. He scratched his head, wondering what could have happened to make Sarah so distressed. As he turned back toward the garden, his gaze fell on the empty bed where her puppies should have been. His heart sank. "Sarah?" he said again, his voice trembling. "Where are your puppies?" Sarah rose weakly to her feet, her body swaying as she steadied herself. She walked toward Pedro and let out a pleading whimper, nudging his hand with her nose. Pedro crouched down, his hands shaking as he realized the gravity of the situation. "They're gone?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. He looked into Sarah's eyes, and for the first time he saw the full depth of her pain. Suddenly, the memory of her frantic barking the night before rushed back to him. The irritation he had felt at her behavior now twisted into guilt. She had been trying to warn him, to protect her puppies, and he had ignored her cries. Pedro stood abruptly, his jaw tightening. "We'll find them, Sarah. I promise." Without wasting another moment, Pedro grabbed his jacket and began preparing to search for the puppies. He didn't know where to start, but Sarah, with her sharp instincts and unwavering determination, was already pulling toward the gate, her nose to the ground. She hadn't given up, and neither would he. As they stepped out onto the street, the morning air felt heavy with purpose. Pedro didn't know what they would face, but he was certain of one thing. They wouldn't stop until Sarah's family was whole again. His puppies, his reason for being, were gone. Minutes later, Pedro, irritated by the relentless barking, left the house once again, determined to confront Sarah. His face was etched with anger as he strode toward the garden. The interruptions to his rest had worn his patience thin, and he was ready to scold her for disturbing the peace yet again. But as he approached Sarah, his frustration began to waver. Her face, usually brimming with energy and life, was now marked by a sorrow so profound it stopped Pedro in his tracks. Her eyes, once filled with trust and vitality, were hollow and dark, reflecting a grief that struck him deeply. Pedro felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Sarah?" he asked, his voice softening instinctively, though he didn't understand what had caused her to appear so devastated. His gaze shifted toward the garden bed, where the puppies had been sleeping just hours before. A chill ran through him as he realized they were gone. Heart pounding, Pedro began searching the yard, calling for the little ones. He peered under bushes, checked behind the kennel, and even scanned the shadows, hoping for any sign of movement. But the puppies were nowhere to be found. That's when his eyes fell on the gate, ajar and swinging gently in the cool night breeze. His breath caught as the realization dawned. Someone had entered. Someone had taken them. "It can't be," he murmured, a chill running down his spine. Pedro turned back to Sarah, as if hoping she could somehow explain what had happened. Her gaze met his, and though she couldn't speak, the anguish in her eyes said more than words ever could. They reflected not only loss, but also despair, a quiet accusation that pierced Pedro's heart. Guilt surged within him, heavy and unrelenting. He crouched beside Sarah, reaching out to unfasten the chain that had held her captive. As soon as she was free, Sarah bolted toward the gate, her nose to the ground, desperate to pick up a scent. Pedro followed, still dazed and consumed by regret. Together, they stepped out into the street. The night was eerily still, the only sound the faint hum of the wind. The dim glow of the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, offering no clues as to where the puppies might have been taken. Pedro and Sarah searched the empty road, their movements frantic at first, but their hope dwindled with every passing minute. Eventually, Pedro stopped. He sank to his knees beside Sarah, who stood frozen, her gaze fixed on some distant, unseen point. The stillness of her body mirrored the void in her heart, the weight of loss anchoring her in place. Pedro placed a hand on her head, his voice breaking as he whispered, "We'll find them. I promise." With tears welling in his eyes and a voice heavy with regret, Pedro gently stroked the head of his loyal companion. "Sarah," he whispered, his words trembling. I didn't know. I didn't know you were trying to protect them. I'm sorry I didn't listen. Sarah, her body slumped and her eyes filled with sorrow, seemed to understand his apology. Her gaze held no resentment, only the silent acceptance of their shared loss. Pedro felt his heart tighten as the weight of his actions settled over him. He had failed her, failed the puppies, and the guilt threatened to consume him. I promise you, he said, his voice firm now, his guilt hardening into resolve. We will find them. I won't rest until your puppies are back where they belong, with you. For a moment, Pedro thought he saw a flicker of hope in Sarah's weary eyes. It was fleeting, but it was enough to ignite a spark of determination within him. They would not give up. As the first light of dawn broke across the sky, the atmosphere was thick with tension and dread. Pedro and Sarah had barely rested, their minds consumed by the same haunting thought, finding the missing puppies. The nightmare had only begun, but Pedro was resolute. This time he would not fail. Rising early, Pedro set out with Sarah by his side. The two moved in silence through the streets, their exhaustion overshadowed by the weight of desperation. Every step felt heavy, each one carrying them further into a fog of uncertainty. But they pressed on, driven by the unspoken bond between them. Their first stop was a small square where a few early risers gathered to enjoy the cool morning air. Pedro approached a group of people, holding out a photo of the puppies. His voice cracked as he explained their disappearance, pleading with them for any information. The strangers listened with sympathetic expressions, but their responses were the same. Shakes of the head, murmurs of denial. No one had seen the puppies. Each rejection only deepened the pit of anguish in Pedro's heart. He looked down at Sarah, who stood beside him, her gaze scanning the square, as if searching for a clue. The silence between them grew heavier as they moved on. Their hope waning, but their determination unshaken. Sarah, her snout low to the ground, approached each passerby, sniffing and observing, as if trying to catch even the faintest trace of her puppies. Pedro walked beside her, holding the photo tightly in his hand, his face marked by exhaustion and worry. As they moved from one area to another, the scenery changed, but the responses remained heartbreakingly consistent. No, we haven't seen them. Each denial chipped away at Pedro's hope, though he tried to remain calm. His clenched jaw and tightened fists betrayed the frustration building inside him. Beside him, Sarah began to show signs of weariness as well. Her steps grew slower, her body heavy with fatigue. Yet every so often, she would lift her nose to the air, her instincts compelling her to search for even the faintest scent of her puppies. Hours passed, and their search brought them to a bustling street filled with vendors peddling their wares. The lively chatter and vibrant stalls contrasted sharply with the heavy cloud of despair that clung to Pedro and Sarah. Pedro, though nearly out of hope, resolved to try one last time. Spotting a fruit vendor, an older man with a kind and weathered face, Pedro approached cautiously. He held out the photo of the puppies, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "Excuse me, sir," he said, the weight of the day evident in his tone. "Have you seen a man with white puppies?" "4 of them. They're very small." The vendor paused, leaning forward to inspect the photo closely. He squinted as if trying to summon a memory, his fingers stroking his chin thoughtfully. Sarah stood beside Pedro, her expectant eyes locked on the vendor's every movement, her body trembling with anticipation. After a moment that felt like an eternity, the man nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, his voice quiet as though he were unsure. "I think I saw them." "There was a strange guy," the vendor said, his voice low and thoughtful. "He was carrying some puppies, white ones, like in the photo. He was walking that way." The man gestured toward a street at the far end of the avenue. Pedro's heart leapt. A spark of hope coursed through him, chasing away some of the despair that had weighed him down. "Thank you," he said earnestly, his gratitude evident. Without wasting another second, Pedro turned toward the street, his steps quickening as Sarah moved beside him, her nose to the ground. The renewed urgency in Pedro's movements seemed to ignite something in Sarah. She began sniffing every corner, every crack in the pavement, her determination to find her puppies driving her forward. As they reached the street the vendor had pointed out, Sarah suddenly froze. Her nose lifted sharply into the air, and she sniffed with intensity. A familiar scent had reached her, one she would recognize anywhere. It was the scent of her puppies. Her body began to tremble with excitement and determination. Without hesitation, she surged forward, following the trail with growing confidence. Her pace quickened, her nose guiding her closer to the source of the smell. Pedro struggled to keep up, his heart pounding with adrenaline as they neared the end of the street. Suddenly, a sharp, firm bark pierced the air, breaking the silence of the deserted street. Pedro stopped in his tracks, startled, and looked toward the source of the sound. It wasn't the puppies, but Sarah's reaction was immediate and unexpected. Her body tensed, and without hesitation, she darted toward the sound. At the end of the street, in front of a small, neglected house, stood a scruffy street dog. His tangled fur and alert eyes gave him a rugged appearance. But there was something in his demeanor that caught Sarah's attention. Pedro watched, confused, as Sarah approached the dog with an air of familiarity. Her tail wagged furiously, and her bark transformed into a high-pitched whine of emotion. The street dog in turn barked back, his posture relaxing as if greeting an old friend. It was clear to Pedro that this was no ordinary meeting. Sarah's reaction told a story Pedro didn't yet know. This dog, though a stranger to Pedro, had once been someone important to Sarah. Long before Pedro had found her, when she roamed the streets in search of food and safety, this dog had been her companion. Together, they had endured countless hardships, sharing scraps of food and guarding each other against the dangers of a hostile world. But when Pedro adopted Sarah, their paths had diverged. Despite the time and distance, the bond they had formed in those difficult days had not faded. Now, as if guided by fate, the two were reunited. Their exchange was wordless yet profound, a silent acknowledgement of their shared past and the loyalty that had never wavered. Pedro stood back, watching the reunion with a mix of awe and confusion. He had never imagined that Sarah's journey would lead to this moment, a reunion born of resilience and a shared history. But amidst the emotion, Pedro's mind remained focused. The puppies were still out there, and this meeting might just hold the key to finding them. The street dog stood firmly in front of the house, its gaze locked on the gate, as if it knew what lay beyond. Sarah, her instincts sharper than ever, began sniffing intensely, her movements quick and deliberate. As she approached the gate, her eyes lit up with recognition and relief. There, in the small garden of the house, were her 4 puppies, curled up, trembling, but alive. Pedro followed closely, his breath catching as his eyes landed on the tiny, fragile bodies of the puppies. A wave of emotion surged through him, filling his heart with immense relief and gratitude. For a moment, it felt as if the weight of the world had lifted. The street dog continued barking, its sharp tone unwavering, as if urging Pedro and Sarah to act. It was clear the dog had known all along where the puppies were. Pedro looked at the dog with newfound understanding. This wasn't just coincidence. This dog had led Sarah here. An act that felt almost like a repayment of an old debt of loyalty. Pedro cautiously pushed the gate open and stepped inside. The puppies stirred at the sight of their mother, their tiny tails wagging eagerly as they let out soft, joyous whimpers. Sarah wasted no time. She rushed to them, her body trembling with relief, and began licking and sniffing them one by one, ensuring they were unharmed. Her eyes glistened with happiness, and the tension that had gripped her for so long finally melted away. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was at peace. Pedro stood back, watching the scene unfold in silence. The reunion between Sarah and her puppies was deeply moving, a testament to the strength of her love and determination. His gaze shifted to the street dog, still standing outside the gate, its sharp eyes observing the scene intently. There was something noble in its posture, a quiet dignity that spoke volumes. Pedro approached the dog, kneeling in front of it. He gently placed a hand on its head, stroking its tangled fur. "Well, my friend," Pedro said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. "It seems you've done a lot for us today." The dog tilted its head slightly, its eyes meeting Pedro's with a mix of understanding and calmness. Pedro smiled, his heart swelling at the thought of what this dog had done for Sarah and her puppies. "If you want," Pedro continued, "you can come home with us. I'm sure Sarah would be happy to have you close." The street dog wagged its tail slightly, a small but hopeful gesture. It was a quiet acknowledgement of Pedro's offer, a sign that perhaps, after all this time, it too was ready for a place to call home. The street dog, as if understanding Pedro's words, stepped forward and accepted the gentle caress. Its rugged demeanor softened for a moment, and it wagged its tail slightly. Sarah, seeing her old companion, moved closer and gave him a soft nudge with her snout, a gesture of gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of his help in her time of need. With her puppies safely gathered and her loyal friend by her side, Sarah finally seemed at ease. Pedro, his heart lighter than it had been in days, motioned for them to follow. Together, the unlikely family began their journey home. The walk back was quiet, the kind of calm that comes after a storm has passed. Pedro couldn't help but reflect on the extraordinary events of the past hours. The loyalty and love Sarah and her street companion had shown were unmatched. They had fought for what mattered most, and together had overcome the odds. When they arrived home, Pedro's first priority was to secure the property. He checked every gate and lock, ensuring that no intruder could ever enter again. The safety of the puppies was paramount now. With the house secure, he turned to the next task at hand. Pedro picked up the phone and dialed the authorities, his voice steady and firm. "Good evening," he began. "I'm calling to report an incident. Last night, someone entered my property and kidnapped my dog's puppies." He paused, glancing toward the small bed where the puppies now lay curled up peacefully. "I have the address where we found them, and I believe the person responsible lives there." Pedro carefully provided all the details of the event, ensuring that the authorities had everything they needed to act. When the call ended, he set the phone down with a deep sigh, hoping justice would be served and that the man who had caused so much pain would no longer pose a threat. Turning back to the garden, Pedro's gaze fell on his new and now larger family. Sarah lay with her puppies nestled close, her body relaxed in a way he hadn't seen in days. The street dog sat nearby, its alert eyes scanning the yard as though it had already taken on the role of guardian. Pedro's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and pride. Despite the challenges they had faced, they were home, safe, and together. And in that moment, surrounded by the unconditional love and loyalty of his companions, Pedro realized he had gained something far greater than he had ever expected. A family bound not by blood, but by trust, resilience, and love. Pedro had promised Sarah they would find her puppies, and together, they had kept that promise. On a quiet morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows, Pedro stood in the kitchen preparing breakfast. The house was peaceful once more. The puppies nestled beside Sarah in the corner of the room. Sarah rested her head against her paws, her body finally at ease after the ordeal. The street dog, her old companion, lay nearby, his watchful eyes following Pedro's movements. The calm was interrupted by the shrill ring of the phone. Both Sarah and the street dog lifted their heads, their ears perked as if sensing the importance of the call. Pedro, too, felt a sudden wave of anticipation as he walked toward the phone, wiping his hands on a towel. He picked up the receiver, his voice steady but filled with nervous expectation. "Hello?" On the other end was a police officer, his tone firm but reassuring. "Mr. Pedro, we're calling to inform you that the man responsible for the kidnapping of the puppies has been arrested." Pedro closed his eyes for a moment, relief washing over him. "That's incredible news," he replied, his voice trembling slightly. The officer continued. "We've identified him as a well-known criminal involved in the theft and trafficking of animals. He planned to sell the puppies on the black market." Pedro's stomach turned at the thought, the images of what might have happened if they hadn't acted in time flashing through his mind. The officer's next words brought him back to the present. "You and your dog helped us uncover someone who has caused a lot of harm. You should feel proud of what you've done. Rest assured, Mr. Pedro, he'll no longer pose a threat to your dogs or any other animals." "Thank you," Pedro said, letting out a deep sigh of relief. "Thank you for everything you've done. It's a comfort to know he won't hurt anyone else." "You're welcome, Mr. Pedro, and thank you for your part in bringing this to our attention," the officer said before ending the call. Pedro set the phone down and leaned against the counter, his heart lighter than it had been in days. He glanced toward the corner of the room, where Sarah watched him intently. Her expressive eyes seemed to reflect his own feelings, a mix of relief, gratitude, and peace. "We did it," Pedro said softly, looking at her and the street dog. The two companions, now part of his growing family, seemed to understand the weight lifted from their lives. The house settled back into calm, but this time, it was a lasting peace. The danger was gone, and for the first time since their ordeal began, Pedro felt the quiet reassurance that they could now move forward together, stronger and more united than ever. Pedro remained silent for a moment, absorbing the news and letting the weight of the past days lift from his shoulders. When he turned around, his eyes met Sarah's and her companions. They watched him closely, their expressions filled with quiet understanding, as if they knew something important had just happened. Kneeling down in front of them, Pedro gently stroked Sarah's head. Her tail wagged slowly, a gesture of renewed happiness and trust. "We did it, Sarah," Pedro said softly, his voice full of emotion. "Everything's okay now. Your pups are safe, and no one will ever hurt us again." Sarah, as if she understood every word, licked Pedro's hand, her gesture a quiet affirmation of the bond they shared. Her puppies, sensing the calm in the air, scurried over to her, their tiny tails wagging with enthusiasm as they sniffed and nuzzled her affectionately. Pedro watched the scene with a deep sense of love and gratitude, his heart swelling at the sight of his once quiet home, now alive with energy and joy. The house that had once been a lonely refuge was now brimming with life. Laughter, playful barking, and the patter of little paws filled every corner. The days that followed became some of the happiest Pedro had ever known. Sarah, her puppies, and her old companion, whom Pedro decided to name Amigo in honor of the bond he and Sarah had shared during their street days, became a true family. Sarah and Amigo quickly fell into a rhythm, exchanging glances and playful nudges as though no time had passed since they were last together. The puppies, too, began to see Amigo as a second protector, following him as loyally as they did their mother. Pedro devoted every morning and evening to caring for his newfound family. Walks became cherished moments of togetherness. The energetic puppies darted around Pedro and Sarah, their tiny paws a blur of motion, while Amigo stayed close, always watchful and protective. The nights, which had once been a source of fear and unease, were now serene. Under the same roof, the family rested in peaceful security, their hearts full of trust and comfort. For Pedro, who had once lived alone in silence, the transformation was profound. Companionship and love now filled every corner of his home. As he watched his family, Sarah, her puppies, and Amigo, he couldn't help but feel that his life, once so solitary, had become a tapestry of loyalty, joy, and unconditional love.